Dr. Ryan King is a visiting assistant professor at NYU, in New York University's Institute for the Study of the Ancient World. He received his bachelor's in classical languages from Duke University in 2014 and his PhD in Near East languages and civilizations from the University of Chicago in 2021. So that was last year. His research focuses on the social, economic, and political history of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, which stretched from the Eastern Mediterranean to South and Central Asia from 550 to 330 BCE. Rhyne maintains a secondary research interest in the later history of pre-Islamic Iran and the comparative empire studies. Rhyne is currently writing a book titled The House of the Satrap and the Making of the Achaemenid Persian Empire 522 to 330 BCE. This manuscript analyzes the mechanism of Achaemenid imperialism through the study of the single institution, the House of Satrap. It is a great honor and privilege to have you, Ryan, and thank you so much for accepting our invitation. We love to hear what the subject, I should say, subject multilingualism and administration in the Achaemenid Persian Empire 559 to 330 BCE, that is from the Cyrus the Great to right the Alexander when conquered Persia. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much for the generous introduction. I'm going to share my screen, which has a PowerPoint mostly full of images for everyone. And I'll go ahead and begin. Over the second half of the 5th century BCE, the conquest of the kings Cyrus, Cambyses, and Darius brought diverse populations under Achaemenid Persian rule. Okay, just making sure my PowerPoint works. Today, I will be discussing the practicalities of administering this empire, particularly regarding the use of various languages in the imperial government. The beginnings of Achaemenid rule in Mesopotamia, which is to say most of what is now modern Iraq and Syria, and the Eastern Mediterranean provide a telling example of the relationship between multilingualism and imperial administration. The Persians supplanted the Neo-Babylonian Empire as the most powerful state in the Middle East, but to do so, they required the support of their new subjects. When Cyrus, the first of the imperial Persian kings, conquered the Babylonian Empire, he sought support among the religious officials of the area. As part of a strategy to generate goodwill, Cyrus allowed religious centers which had fallen into neglect under the Babylonian kings to be restored. One of the most famous documents from the Achaemenid Empire, the Cyrus Cylinder, provides an account of Cyrus's actions. Although the Cyrus Cylinder contains first-person narration from the Persian king, it was not written by the king himself, but rather by Babylonian priests who supported Cyrus's reign and policies. According to this text, Cyrus says, "From Babylon to Ashur, and from Susa, Agade, Eshnuna, Zamban, Meturnu, Dare, as far as the regions of Gutium," and these places are all in Iraq and Western Iran. The sacred centers on the other sides of the Tigris, whose sanctuaries had been abandoned for a long time. I returned the images of the gods who had resided there to their places, and I let them dwell in eternal abodes. Cyrus's actions allowed for the revitalization of religious practices and religious groups across the Middle East. In addition to the Cyrus Cylinder, Cyrus's actions are independently recorded in the Hebrew Bible, also known as the Old Testament. During the period of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, many Judeans had been deported from the southern Levant, so the eastern Mediterranean coast, and settled in Babylonia. Cyrus's conquest of the Babylonian Empire led to many Judeans returning to Jerusalem, where they could rebuild their temple. Cyrus's actions are recorded with jubilation in the book of Isaiah, which says, "Thus says the Lord, your Redeemer, and he who formed you from the womb, who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and he shall perform all my pleasure, saying to Jerusalem, you shall be built, and to the temple, your foundation shall be laid." But the construction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem did not come without difficulties. The practicalities of the construction of the Second Temple occupy much of another book of the Hebrew Bible, the book of Ezra. After providing another account of Cyrus's decree that allowed for the construction of the temple in Jerusalem, the book of Ezra turns to the obstacles that the Judeans faced constructing the temple. Opponents of the Judeans who did not want them to construct the temple wrote a letter to the reigning Persian king Artaxerxes to attempt to stop the construction. Although the vast majority of the Hebrew Bible is naturally written in the Hebrew language, the book of Ezra switches to another language, Aramaic, at this point. I will return to the reasons for this shortly. The Aramaic letter to the king argues that the city of Jerusalem had previously been rebellious and that Jerusalem may rebel again. The king replies in another Aramaic letter that his subordinates have found that Jerusalem indeed had rebelled in the past and that the temple construction must stop. However, the Judeans continued to build their temple. As a result, the Persian governor asks them why they were continuing to do so. Conveyed in another Aramaic letter, the Judeans explain that King Cyrus had issued a decree to allow them to build a temple in Jerusalem and that the king should check the royal archives in Babylon for confirmation. The king commands a search to be made and finds a written decree not in Babylon, but rather in Ecbatana, the modern city of Hamadan in western Iran. The Aramaic text of this decree is recorded in Ezra. The king writes another Aramaic letter to his governor, ordering him to allow the construction of the temple to continue. It is at this point in the narrative that the language switches back to Hebrew and the construction of the temple is completed without further issue. I've begun my lecture today with this narrative from Ezra because it conveys a very typical example of the relationship between multilingualism and governance in the Achaemenid Empire. If we conceptualize the narrative in Ezra very schematically, we can see that the problem solving follows this process on screen. Problems are first conceptualized and accounted for in a language of only local use, in this case Hebrew. To communicate with high governmental officials, the local leaders write a letter in Aramaic. This Aramaic letter was conveyed to high-ranking Persian speakers in the core of the empire. The Persian kings spoke Old Persian, a progenitor to modern Persian or Farsi, but Old Persian was not generally used as a written language for administration. After finding the proper written documentation, again in Aramaic, the Central Persian administrators wrote another letter in Aramaic to the Judeans. Business of purely local concerns, such as the construction of the temple in Jerusalem, could then continue in the local language, that is Hebrew. The Persian administrators developed a system to accommodate a variety of administrative languages in their empire. By allowing local administration to continue in vernacular languages while incorporating Aramaic as an empire-wide bridge, across Persian administrators. So now I'll be talking about multilingualism as a response to imperial diversity. After the initial conquest of the early kings, the Achaemenids faced a new problem, governing an empire of unprecedented scale. Transitory conquest states are not uncommon throughout history, but lasting imperial governments are far rarer. Prior to the Achaemenid Empire, the most populous state in the history of the world had been the Neo-Assyrian Empire, so again, centered on what is now Iraq and Syria. But the Achaemenid Empire was on the order of 4 to 5 times more populous. Moreover, this population was extremely heterogeneous, with dozens of different ethnic groups now subject to Achaemenid rule. In order to manage their diverse empire, the Achaemenids required administrative systems that would be able to coordinate local leaders, imperial officers across the empire, and the royal court at the center. There were 2 possible approaches to this problem. The first was to mandate the use of a single administrative language across the empire. No government could mandate the private use of different languages, but a government could use a single language for all administration. This was, for example, the approach taken by the kingdoms of China. However, to take such an approach in the Achaemenid Empire would have been a difficult task. The kings were speakers of Old Persian, but this was a language with no writing system prior to Achaemenid rule. Old Persian would have been intelligible to a number of people on the Iranian plateau, but there were few speakers of Iranian languages west of the Zagros Mountains in what is now Western Iran. In the western half of the empire, groups spoke a variety of different languages. A late form of Akkadian was common in Mesopotamia. Aramaic was widely spoken in Syria and the Levant. Egyptians naturally spoke Egyptian. Various Anatolian languages such as Lydian, Carian, and Lycian dominated Anatolia, and the residents of the Greek city-states used different dialects of Greek. Instead of using a single administrative language, the Achaemenids took a different approach. They let local administration continue in vernacular languages, but chose a language that could work across space as well. For this connective language, they chose Aramaic, a language from the Semitic family that is closely related to Hebrew. Why Aramaic? There were 2 main reasons, but both require additional historical context. Prior to forming an empire, the Persians had learned a great deal about governance and state building from their neighbors, the Elamites. Elamite-speaking peoples had occupied southwestern Iran, including what is now Khuzestan and Fars, for over 2,000 years prior to the Achaemenid Empire. The Elamites engaged with the intellectual traditions of Mesopotamia, and as a result, had adopted the writing system of the region, cuneiform. Cuneiform is the world's oldest writing system, comprised of many wedge-based characters that are usually pressed onto a clay tablet with a reed. Cuneiform had been used to write a number of languages in antiquity, but by the time of the mid-1st millennium BCE, it was mainly used to write 2 languages, Akkadian, the main language of Mesopotamia, and Elamite. Elamite writing would have been the chief language of administration known to the pre-imperial Persians. Akkadian would have been the second most familiar administrative language. But both languages were difficult to learn because of the large number of signs. In contrast to alphabets where one sign indicates a single phoneme or sound, cuneiform signs represent either syllables or entire words. The same sign, moreover, can represent multiple syllables or words. These factors made written Elamite a difficult language to learn, and high-level literacy was restricted to specialized scribes. Aramaic, however, was written with an alphabet. In contrast to the couple hundred individual signs in Akkadian or Elamite, the Aramaic alphabet has a mere 22 letters, which made learning how to write it considerably easier than learning how to write a cuneiform language. This ease of use and learning was the first major advantage to using Aramaic as a connective language of administration. The second advantage to using Aramaic is that there was a developed scribal tradition in the language prior to the Achaemenid conquest. The Assyrian and Babylonian empires, which controlled Mesopotamia prior to the Achaemenids, had begun to use Aramaic as an administrative language alongside the traditional Akkadian cuneiform. Aramaic tended to be written on materials like parchment, while Akkadian was written on the abundant clay. The precise details of this practice remain unclear. Achaemenid Aramaic is far better documented than earlier Mesopotamian Aramaic, but it is evident that there was a scribal class trained in Aramaic administration already. Therefore, access to these pre-existing trained administrators and their tools for future education was the second major reason to use Aramaic as a language of governance. Although Aramaic was spoken by a number of the empire's subjects, for the Persian court, it was strictly a language of written administration, while Old Persian and related Iranian languages were chiefly used for spoken communication. This is clear in the Aramaic letters themselves. Letters dictated by Persian speakers to scribes writing in Aramaic often contain Persian words simply transcribed into the Aramaic alphabet. This is not to say that these Aramaic letters were of poor quality. In fact, as we will see, the Aramaic across the Achaemenid Empire from Egypt to Afghanistan was remarkably consistent, which is clear evidence for centralized scribal training. But these Persian words which appear in the Aramaic text are clear evidence that many of these documents were dictated by Persian speakers for other Persian speakers. Aramaic was simply the written language by which these messages were transmitted. At a local level, the Achaemenid Empire took advantage of the pre-existing governmental structures that had already existed in many regions of their empire. The people of Mesopotamia and Egypt had been keeping records for over 2,000 years prior to Achaemenid rule, and local administration continued in Akkadian and Egyptian, respectively. The two great mercantile city-state cultures of the Mediterranean, the Greeks and the Phoenicians, continued to produce local documentation in their vernaculars. Hebrew was used alongside Aramaic in Judah. Multilingual scribes could translate and synthesize documentation in these local languages and produce summaries in Aramaic for transmission across the empire when necessary. In areas without traditions of writing prior to Achaemenid rule, the Achaemenids imported traditions with which they were familiar, Aramaic for transregional affairs, as well as Elamite for local accounting. While the diversity of the empire's peoples can appear daunting, the Achaemenids used multilingualism as a tool to govern this heterogeneous empire. At the imperial center and replicated in governors' courts across the empire, the Achaemenids typically spoke Old Persian or related Iranian languages, but although they wrote monumental inscriptions in Old Persian, they did not generally write administrative documentation in the language. Aramaic was used as an empire-wide bridge to link Iranian language speakers as well as to translate across local vernaculars. At local levels across the empire, administration continued in the traditional languages. There was no reason to intervene in practices which already worked. And in regions without histories of writing, the administrative languages of southwestern Iran were imported. Multilingualism became a solution to govern this diverse empire. In the rest of this talk, I will explain how this multilingual system worked in 4 places: Persepolis, Egypt, Anatolia, and Afghanistan. Finally, I will turn to the afterlife of Achaemenid administration in South Asia after the empire's fall. So first, I'll be discussing Persepolis. After securing the throne, King Darius I, who reigned from 522 to 486, built a new palatial complex in southwestern Iran. The Persians themselves simply called this settlement Parsa or Persia, but later Greek authors would call the site Persepolis, which is the common name now. In the 1930s, excavators from the University of Chicago led an archaeological exploration of the site and discovered two groups of tablets. The smaller archive was located in a building known as the Treasury and is now called the Persepolis Treasury Archive. The larger was found inside the wall system around the palaces and is known as the Persepolis Fortification Archive. Together, both groups of documents provide unparalleled information on how administration in the heart of the empire worked. But today I will focus on the Fortification Archive, which provides a glimpse at the multilingual administration in the imperial heartland. The contents of the fortification text are, on the whole, quite mundane. These were documents written by civil servants to be read by other civil servants. The purpose of this documentation was to account for the income, storage, redistribution, and outlay of food and drinks in the region around Persepolis. This food was used for a variety of different purposes. It was used to pay governmental officials. It fed the court of the king and other members of the royal family. It was given as rations to laborers working in the area, and it was used to pay travelers on the vast network of roads. By far the most important commodity was grain, the basis of the diet, but the records also document fruit and animal products, especially from sheep and goats. Depending on the particular region, the main beverage was either beer or wine. Both drinks had a considerably lower alcohol content than their modern counterparts, and this low level of alcohol made these beverages safer than water. The Persepolis Fortification Archive is a snapshot over a short period of time. The texts only date to the reign of Darius I, and the majority of the texts fall within a 4-year range of the 21st to 24th year of his reign. There's no reason to think that this administration ended after the last year recorded in the archive. Rather, we have only discovered a small part of what was originally a much larger set of documentation. The great majority of the surviving texts are written in Elamite. As I discussed earlier, Elamite was the chief administrative language of southwestern Iran prior to Achaemenid rule, and at Susa, in what is now Khuzestan, excavators have discovered a smaller archive from slightly before the Achaemenid period that records similar administrative practices. Therefore, the Achaemenid administrators at Persepolis drew upon long-established practices from their Elamite predecessors and neighbors. Most of the Elamite texts in the Fortification Archive fall into one of two groups: primary records, which document single deposits or disbursements, and secondary accounts, which synthesize these primary records. One of the most abundant types of primary records are the disbursements of rations for travelers. The Achaemenid road system allowed people on official business to travel from Turkey to Uzbekistan or Egypt to Pakistan and draw from storehouses along the entire way. Travel texts were produced by administrators at these storehouses who accounted for the food they gave to the travelers. The texts themselves are usually short and fairly standardized. They record who gave how much food to the travelers and often give an origin and a destination. Complementing the Elamite texts are crucial pieces of nonverbal information, seal impressions. So on the image on screen, the right image has a seal impression where my mouse cursor is. It's a scene of animals. Seals were carved onto stones with distinct images that could be recognized by administrators. They were impressed into the wet clay tablets to authenticate documentation. On the travel rations, the seals follow the same pattern. The administrator of the storehouse impressed his seal on the flat edge of the tablet, which is to say here, the seal impression is not visible on the slide. and the traveler or the leader of the traveling party in the case of a group impressed his seal below the Elamite text on the tablet. So that is the image I demonstrated earlier. The seals were arguably more important than the texts themselves. More people could recognize the images than could read the Elamite. The secondary accounts take many of the primary records and tabulate them over an accounting period, typically a year. These accounts are often records of all the transactions at a single place, such as one of the aforementioned storehouses on the road system. The accounts take a distinct tablet shape. They are rectangles, which are much larger than the primary records. A line drawn down the left side of the tablet separates arithmetic on the left from the description of the accounts on the right. So on the text on screen, you can see a line faintly drawn here with these are numerals on the left and descriptions on the right. Once these accounts were produced using the primary records themselves were no longer necessary, and they may then have been destroyed or stored elsewhere. There were not only Elamite texts in the Persepolis Fortification Archive. In addition, there were two other major groups of documents: Aramaic texts written in ink on clay tablets and sealed tablets without writing. So Aramaic on the left and sealed but uninscribed on the right. Neither of these groups has been studied as much as the Elamite text, but I can present some preliminary findings. The uninscribed but sealed tablets conveyed information without texts. Certain officials could communicate specific messages with only their seal. The Aramaic tablets are considerably fewer in number than the Elamite ones, with around 800 Aramaic tablets compared to the 15,000 Elamite texts. The Aramaic tablets convey similar sorts of information as the Elamite documents, but their contents tend to be even more abbreviated than those of the Elamite texts. In addition to these Aramaic tablets, there were additional Aramaic texts written on perishable material, such as parchment, that has disappeared since antiquity. This is evident because of an Aramaic epigraph that appears in ink on a number of Elamite texts. So on the image on screen, we have an Elamite text on the top of the tablet, a large seal impression in the middle, and a single Aramaic epigraph on the bottom in ink. Dozens of Elamite tablets have a single Aramaic word written in ink on them, nasih, meaning copied. Aspects of these Elamite documents were translated and likely synthesized into Aramaic text, which would have been written on perishable material. These Aramaic texts themselves do not survive from Persepolis, but similar Aramaic documentation survives from elsewhere, as I will discuss later. This relationship between Elamite and Aramaic at Persepolis resembles the general schema I discussed above. Administrative matters of local purview were written in a local language, in this case Elamite, and synthesized into Aramaic. And now I'll turn to Egypt. Egypt is home to the world's second oldest system of writing after Mesopotamia, and the Achaemenids drew upon these scribal traditions in their administration of the region. The oldest form of Egyptian writing was the famous hieroglyphs, which continued to be used throughout the history of ancient Egypt, especially in contexts intended for the public, such as on temples or stela. The use of hieroglyphic Egyptian continued under Achaemenid rule, and the Persian kings themselves occasionally used hieroglyphs to write inscriptions, such as on a statue depicting King Darius I as a pharaoh, which was made in Egypt but brought to Susa in southwestern Iran. And the hieroglyphs on this statue are on the base. They're only faintly visible in this photo. Most of the day-to-day writing in Egypt used a different cursive script called Demotic. This recorded the same language as the hieroglyphs, but in a different form of writing. Egypt's extremely dry climate means that texts written on perishable material survive at a far greater rate here than in most other regions. Moreover, Egypt is blessed with an important natural resource, the papyrus reed, which could be worked into a relatively cheap material on which to write. Thanks to these two factors, there's an abundance of surviving texts from Achaemenid Egypt, and we can see that many local communities continued their administrative practices in Demotic Egyptian with little change under imperial rule. But with the Achaemenid conquest came the implantation of a higher level administration, which conducted its written business in Aramaic. The varieties of tasks the Persian government oversaw in Egypt is evident from the documentation, as we have, for example, a letter asking for the government's assistance in resolving a dispute between two temples, as well as a customs account recording all the taxes levied on ships entering and exiting Egypt over the course of a calendar year. The group of sources that reveals the most about imperial administration in Egypt is a group of letters pertaining to the affairs of the royal prince, Arshama, who served as the satrap or governor in Egypt in the late 5th century. Arshama, like other Persian elites, had his letters written in Aramaic, but this Aramaic was full of Old Persian words. Loan words typically tend to be specific or technical terms that have reference that are difficult to translate. In English, you may think of food words like sushi or pizza, which are loans from Japanese and Italian, respectively. Arshama's Aramaic contains a few of these types of loan words from Old Persian, such as dashna, a word denoting a type of land grant, and gurda, a word for a specific class of worker. And just to clarify this slide, on the left, you have the Aramaic word, which is transcribed into the English alphabet. As you can see, Aramaic doesn't write all the vowels. The middle is the Old Persian form of this word, and the far right is the meaning of the word. What is comparatively strange about Arshama's Aramaic is the number of Old Persian words for which there were almost certainly Aramaic words that could have been used. For example, kasunazva, meaning loss, or vispazana, meaning of every kind. These types of loans are indicative of the spoken language of the writer and the recipients. Arshama dictated his letters in his native Old Persian, and though his scribes translated the sense into Aramaic, they did not need to translate every individual word. The audience of Arshama's letters often were native speakers of Old Persian too, and if not, had enough familiarity with Old Persian to understand these words embedded in the Aramaic. At the same time, Arshama's court interacted with the lower levels of local Egyptian administration. Arshama employed a number of workers to run the day-to-day operations of both the government and his own personal agricultural estates in Egypt. Some of these men have Egyptian language names, and though some of them knew Aramaic, their native tongue was almost certainly Egyptian. Comparison with other documentation from Egypt suggests that Egyptian scribes then produced another text with relevant material in Demotic Egyptian. Therefore, with the Arshama correspondence, we can see the typical way the imperial administration interacted with local traditions. Persian-speaking administrators communicated across the empire via Aramaic writing, and local matters could then be translated or summarized into a vernacular. The situation in Egypt parallels the Ezra story. And now I'll be turning to Anatolia. To examine the multilingual system in Anatolia, I will consider a single trilingual inscription from the city of Xanthos in the region known as Lycia, and that is here on the map. In the Achaemenid period, Anatolia, the large peninsula which makes up most of modern-day Turkey, can be divided heuristically into two parts: a great number of cities along the western and northwestern coast, and a more rural interior where many Persians held agricultural estates. The coastal cities, by and large, were inhabited by Greek speakers who had lived in Western Anatolia for hundreds of years prior to Persian rule. In the interior of Anatolia, Many of the residents would have been first language speakers of a now extinct branch of the Indo-European language family called the Anatolian languages, including languages such as Carian, Lydian, Lycian, and Phrygian. Several inscriptions found in Western Anatolia were written in both Greek and an Anatolian language, which suggests that Greek and Anatolian speakers lived alongside one another, and we may presume that a number of people knew both Greek and an Anatolian language. In the region of Lycia in southwestern Anatolia, Xanthos was the largest and wealthiest city. In the Persian period, Lycia was dominated by a number of aristocratic families who competed among themselves with elaborate and self-aggrandizing artwork and inscriptions, as shown on screen is one example. The Achaemenid imperial authorities rarely chose to intervene directly into affairs in Lycia, as they instead chose to work with and through some of these local families. However, an inscription from the very end of Achaemenid rule at Xanthos provides a rare instance of Achaemenid intervention. The inscription is written in 3 languages, Greek, Lycian, and Aramaic, and describes the legal, economic, and religious privileges of a newly founded religious organization in the area. The Greek and Lycian versions are very similar in content and were both written for the local audience who could understand one or both of these languages. In contrast, the Aramaic version summarizes the others and adds other details. This trilingual inscription provides an example of how Achaemenid administrators used Aramaic as a bridge to local traditions. But to understand how, I will first summarize the Greco-Lycian version and then compare it to the Aramaic. The Greco-Lycian version begins by stating that a man named Pixodaris was the satrap or governor over Lycia, and that he had previously named 2 other men as sub-rulers of Lycia, and a third man as the governor of Xanthos specifically. Then it states that the people of Xanthos decreed that an altar be erected for the worships of the gods Basileus, Caunius, and Archesimas, and it establishes the priest for the cult. The next 2 sections both describe the economic status and support for the cult in the form of tax exemptions, a gift of agricultural land, guaranteed annual revenue, and revenue from emancipated slaves. The following 2 sections decree that all of the above is consecrated and that the gods will regularly receive prescribed sacrifices. The text closes with the people of Xanthos swearing that they will abide by the procedures established on the stela, and if anyone should not, they will be found guilty before the gods, and Pixodaris, the satrap, will be the arbiter in the case. The Aramaic text differs in a number of ways. First, the officials in Lycia and in Xanthos named in the civic versions are unmentioned in the Aramaic. In the Achaemenid government, these officials would have reported directly to the satrap Pixodaris. If there were any communication between the royal court and Lycia, it would have gone through Pixodaris himself. These officials' names and positions are more or less irrelevant from the point of view of the highest imperial administrators. In contrast to this abbreviation, however, the Aramaic does name the reigning king, Artaxerxes IV, to date the text, and moreover specifies that Pixodaris was satrap in neighboring Caria as well as Lycia. Caria, bordering Lycia to the north, was in fact a far more important region to the empire's political structure, but goes entirely unmentioned in the civic versions of the text. Pixodaris needed to rely on local authorities in Lycia because he himself resided in Caria. The description of the altar and its privileges is considerably abbreviated in the Aramaic. The priest's family is not discussed, the temple's land is not described in detail, and the revenue from manumission is not mentioned at all. The final section describing the punishment for not following the terms of the stela is largely similar, and even adds another god who will judge offenders, but omits the detail that Pixodaris will handle any disputes. This may seem a curious section to omit considering the greater detail on Pixodaris provided previously, but this provision is redundant in the context of the Imperial Aramaic. Pixodaris was already named as the satrap, and it was always the satrap's duty to hear disputes among subject groups. Stating that Pixodaris would hear disputes was not necessary. The Xanthos Trilingual reveals many details about how multilingualism interacted with administration in the Achaemenid Empire. The local languages of administration themselves could be multilingual. The Greek and Lycian versions communicate the same message to a bilingual local population. The Aramaic takes only the most important information from the civic version as an imperial record, but also adds details unimportant to the civic body that mattered to central administrators. Both versions, the local and the imperial, were official, but they were aimed at two different audiences with different informational needs. The satrap Pixodaris also tells us about the linguistic habits of the administrators. Pixodaris's family was of local Carian origin, and he was presumably a native speaker of Carian. He and his family's inscriptions of local concern in Caria were written in the vernacular languages of Carian and Greek. At Xanthos, Pixodaris appears as the guarantor of the local administrative languages of Lycian and Greek, while he and his office communicated the transregional record in Aramaic. Pixodaris himself may or may not have been able to read Aramaic. That is impossible to know, but scribes working with him were certainly trained in the language for transregional communications. At the same time, Pixodaris would have played host to a number of elite Persians during his time as satrap, and it is very likely that he learned to speak Old Persian himself for such occasions. Being an Achaemenid administrator was, by necessity, a multilingual affair. I'm now going to turn to what is now Afghanistan. In this section, I will discuss how the Achaemenid administration approached regions of its empire, modern Afghanistan in particular, that had little or no history of written record keeping prior to Achaemenid rule. The evidence from Afghanistan is sparser than in the regions previously discussed, but what survives suggests that the Achaemenids imported multilingual administrative practices into the region, rather than using a monolingual administrative system. Written evidence from Achaemenid Afghanistan comes from two distinct regions. The first is Arachosia, the region around modern Kandahar in southwestern Afghanistan. So on this map, that's this region here. The earliest discovered documentation from the Arachosian administration came not from Arachosia itself, but from Persepolis, where dozens of fragments of stone objects, bowls, plates, mortars, and pestles provide administrative information in Aramaic. The texts themselves vary in length, but they all record similar information about the transfer of the vessels from Arachosia to Persepolis. I've provided an example of one of the texts on screen. As you can see in bold, the text notes that the object was produced under the authority of a treasurer from Arachosia, which is how we can link the objects to the region. And the text also specified that the objects came from a specific fortress within Arachosia. So that bit is at the beginning of the text. Fortresses such as these had administrative functions as well as military ones in the Achaemenid Empire. In addition to the one named here, the text named two other fortresses which produced these vessels, recorded the administrative information, and organized their movement to Persepolis. From these texts, therefore, we can tell that there were at least 3 administrative bureaus in Arachosia, which produced information in Aramaic and communicated with the imperial government in Persepolis. In these texts, Aramaic served one of its typical roles as a vehicle for transregional communication. More recently published evidence from Arachosia indicates that Elamite was also used at a local level in a way that resembles the system at Persepolis. Excavators at Old Kandahar found 2 fragments of clay tablets, both bearing bits of Elamite cuneiform on them. A few words survive legibly. One, kortash, is a very common word at Persepolis denoting a class of worker. Another phrase, Shuturdaka, is commonly used on accounting texts at Persepolis. With such small fragments, we are obviously in somewhat conjectural ground, but the appearance of Achaemenid administrative terms in Elamite, a language that before the Achaemenids never had been found so far east, suggests an administrative bureau implanted by the Achaemenids that mirrored the system found at Persepolis. In combination with the Aramaic texts about Arachosia from Persepolis itself, the administration at Arachosia mirrors that at Persepolis, with Elamite text used alongside Aramaic texts. In northern Afghanistan, in the region known as Bactria, which is here on the map, administrative documentation has recently come to light. The arid climate has preserved types of material that typically do not survive, namely documents on leather and on wooden sticks. The leather documents vary in their content, and they include a correspondence written by the highest-ranking Persian official in the region, the satrap Ahvamazda, addressed to one of his subordinates. The Aramaic of these letters has all the hallmarks of typical Imperial Aramaic, standard Aramaic grammar infused with Persian words simply transcribed into the Aramaic alphabet. The language of these documents is so similar to other Aramaic letters, especially from Egypt, that it is clear that Imperial administration organized standard scribal training in Imperial Aramaic across the realm. In addition to these letters, there are a number of accounts which appear to summarize a series of prior transactions. These documents may be equivalent to the Aramaic texts from Persepolis that were said to be copied from Elamite. Finally, the wooden sticks are a unique form of document that allowed the literate Achaemenid administration to enter into credit relationships with non-literate parties, in this case, shepherds. Tally marks on the sticks indicated quantities which the non-literate parties could count, while a description in Aramaic remained with the literate party. The material from Bactria, moreover, demonstrates how the Achaemenid administrative system continued after the last of the Achaemenid kings, as one of the accounts dates to the reign of Alexander III of Macedon. Altogether, the material from Afghanistan shows the ways in which the imperial administration implemented their systems in regions with no prior tradition of writing. High-level administrators used Aramaic to write letters, and Aramaic was the form for summaries of other material. Aramaic was also used for lower value transactions in the case of tally sticks. In addition, the tablet fragments from Old Kandahar indicate that the Achaemenids imported their use of Elamite administration from southwestern Iran into Central Asia. The system in Afghanistan again resembles the schema I have outlined at the beginning of the talk, but with Elamite introduced as a language of local use here in the far east of the empire. And for my brief final section, I'm going to turn to South Asia after the Achaemenid rule. Alexander III of Macedon conquered the Achaemenid Empire in a series of battles in the 330s and 320s. After his death, the Achaemenid Empire split into a number of smaller kingdoms. This period of time after the Achaemenid Empire and before the Roman conquest of the Mediterranean is known as the Hellenistic Period and is often regarded for the spread of Greek culture across the former Achaemenid territories and beyond. To end today's lecture, I would like to briefly discuss the Hellenistic period to provide an example of the survival and transformation of Achaemenid administrative practices. One of the kingdoms that arose in the early Hellenistic period was the Marian Empire of South Asia. On this map, that's the empire on the far right, which extends farther than this map actually shows. Emerging out of a core in the Ganges River Valley, the Marian armies led by King Chandragupta conquered the former Achaemenid lands of the Indus River Valley and Arachosia in the late 4th century. Ashoka, Chandragupta's grandson and the third Marian king, left the most famous records from the Marian period in the form of a series of rock-carved inscriptions, which are traditionally called edicts, that can be found across South Asia. The content of the text bears little resemblance to anything Achaemenid. They are mostly proclamations of Ashoka's conversion to Buddhism. However, the form of these inscriptions tells a different story. All of Ashoka's earliest known edicts, written in the 10th year of his reign, were written in Aramaic, the traditional language of Achaemenid administration. Ashoka's edict at Kandahar is bilingual in Aramaic and Greek, Greek being the language of the Hellenistic cultural elite, and Aramaic being the standard Achaemenid language of written communication. Ashoka's edicts at Lakhman and Taxila, both in northern Pakistan, were written solely in Aramaic. Later in his reign, Ashoka wrote Prakrit language edicts in the South Asian scripts Kharoshti and Brahmi. The Kharoshti script is agreed to be derived from Achaemenid Imperial Aramaic, and Brahmi likely was as well, though this is not universally accepted. Moreover, the Prakrit word Ashoka uses to refer to his inscriptions, lipi, is in fact a loan word from the Old Persian word dipi, which itself was a loan from the Elamite word tupi. The word naturally came to South Asia with the implantation of Achaemenid administration. Therefore, in word, language, and script, the Ashoka edicts show the imprint of the Achaemenid administration even a century after the empire's fall. Thank you all for your attention.